Um, Very good to see you all. This is the third event in a series of events that aim at shedding light on several aspects of state-inflicted violence, as well as political perspectives of overcoming them. The occasion, as you all know, for this series is that 100 years ago, Walter Benjamin penned his short essay of the same name, Critiques of Violence, offering a radical refusal of all forms of violence connected to the law, and finally calling for an abolition of state power. As I've stated in the other events too, and it's also in the description of the series of events, this is not supposed to be about Benjamin's essay in the narrow sense. Rather, the series attempts to bring together scholars from different regional but also theoretical backgrounds and invites them to address the topics present in the essay from their own political and philosophical perspectives, utilizing conceptual tools developed in their respective theoretical traditions and fields of activity. Benjamin's essay thus does not serve as the basis for a close reading, but as an inspiration and as a starting point to explore the question of violence from several locally bound taxonomies. Many of the topics raised by Benjamin in his essay a century ago are obviously of pressing urgency today. States have aggregated unprecedented amounts of violence and proved to be no longer capable to contain or mitigate it by means of democratic control or judicial oversight. Mass incarceration, police brutality, internment, and deportation and military interventions are but the most visible instances of state-inflicted violence, which in addition often works hand in hand with extra-legal forms of violence against marginalized and vulnerabilized groups. At the same time, a multitude of political movements has formed to protest and resist these forms of violence, be it prison abolitionist groups, Black Lives Matter movements, or refugee and no border activism. These groups often do not simply reject contemporary instances of violence, but at the same time try to come up with alternative models of political autonomy, conflict resolution, and criminal justice beyond the state and legal coercion. In this constellation, the actuality of both state violence and of resistance against it, this constellation lets it seem worthwhile to engage with Benjamin's questions once again a second later. Now, one of the terms introduced by Benjamin that later became theoretically influential, most prominently in the work of Joshua Gambin, but also many others, is the notion of bare life or mere life. For Benjamin, mythical, that is, legal violence, according to Benjamin, not only erects a form of, as he says, bloody power over the living, it also sanctifies mere life at the expense of a just or a political life. At the same time, legal power finds in mere life also a limit. As the quote that became the title for today's event states, in mere life, the rule of law over the living ceases. This observation seems also of pressing urgency today. If it is true that more and more areas in the world are subject to necropolitical regimes, regimes that constantly render the lives of its populations disposable, then this must have important implications for the question of resistance and political agency. As Achille Mbembe has forcefully put it in his seminal text Necropolitics, quote, under the conditions of necropower, the lines between resistance and suicide, sacrifice and redemption, martyrdom and freedom are blurred. Among the tactics emerging at this focal point of partisanship and sacrifice are, for example, the hunger strike, self-immolation, and others. Just think of the resistance against the necropolitical conditions in the camp Moria on Lesbos. Residents saw no other escape than to burn down their own camp, putting their own lives at risk for the sake of their survival. I'm very excited that I could convince an internationally renowned expert on these questions to join us for today's talk, namely Banu. Banu, your work is much discussed in Amsterdam in in connection with these topics. I have talked about your work in many of my seminars. I'm really very happy that you agreed to give a talk today. I'm just going to introduce Banu quickly for those who don't know her yet. Banu Bargu is Associate Professor of History of Consciousness at the University of California at Santa Cruz. And currently she is a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Princeton. Her research focuses on the uses of the body in political and social struggles, both as an object and as a subject of violence directed at itself. Drawing on different examples from around the world, she examines the implications corporal politics holds for modern conceptions of agency, citizenship, and democracy. Among her many publications is Starve and Immolate, The Politics of Human Weapons, that came out with Columbia University Press in 2014, which really deals exactly with the examples that are at the heart of today's event. And before I hand over the virtual microphone to Banu, I just wanted to quickly say thanks to our hosts and the sponsors of this event, which is not very expensive, cost nothing. But anyway, the series is supported by the Philosophy Department of the University of Amsterdam, the Philosophy and Public Affairs Group, the Amsterdam School for Cultural Analysis, ASCA, the Netherlands Institute for Cultural Analysis, NICA, and the Goethe Institute, Amsterdam. Thank you very much. And once again, we will record the lecture, but I will stop the recording right after. So for the Q&A, then you can ask away your question. The talk will be roughly 45 minutes, and then we'll have, I think enough time to also ask questions and comment on the talk. I ask everyone, as usually, to mute themselves during the talk, and then for the discussion, of course, if you want to say something, then you simply unmute yourself, and hopefully we'll find a way to not interrupt each other all the time. But in the past, it worked out fine. So thanks again, Banu, for being here, and I give you the word.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Well, thank you, first of all, for that very generous introduction. I will spend the next 2 hours trying to earn the praises. I don't know if I can live up to it, and thanks to all of you for being here. I'm really excited, and thank you also, Daniel, for giving me an occasion to actually return to Benjamin's text, which has been a text that's been quite influential in my own work, but not something that I've written on directly. So this was really a challenging occasion to kind of put my thoughts to paper. Okay, let me just get started. Walter Benjamin was fond of jotting notes from his conversations with friends in his diary, and there are many such notes from his sustained interactions with Bertolt Brecht. In what might be the last of such notes, from August 25, 1938, he quotes what he calls a Brechtian maxim: "Don't start from the good old things, but the bad new ones." Taking this Brechtian injunction to heart, and assuming that Benjamin would have also endorsed doing so, even though it was so contrary to his proclivities as a thinker invested in rescuing the good old things from the past, I turn today to Benjamin's infamous essay, The Critique of Violence. I want to read this essay starting not from the good old things, but the bad new ones, very much in a Brechtian spirit, which also fascinated Benjamin. So what are these bad new things that I have in mind? First, the increasing concentration of forces at the disposal of the state to deploy violence, whether by militarized urban policing, the new range of digital means of tracking and surveying, mass incarceration, or by the sheer increase in the arsenal of weapons and capacities of destruction amassed and utilized in case of international conflict, especially in the context of irregular and localized warfare. Second, the big shifts in the nature of violence that must be contemplated in relation to the changes in the agents of violence that Benjamin's essay so prominently features. That is, the presence of social struggles spearheaded by the working class, which have all but disappeared on the one hand, and the emergence of new and radical non-state actors who challenge the state's monopoly of violence, both domestically and internationally on the other. Particularly, non-state forms of violence that have become prevalent around the world with decolonization in the second half of the 20th century, and irregular warfare that has stamped the early 21st century with the global war on terror. These are actors on a global warscape that has emerged as the boundaries and rules of war sustained by what Carl Schmitt would call the Jus Publicum Europaeum have unraveled. We might recall how the same Schmitt, in his 1963 sequel to the concept of the political, would pinpoint the partisan as the new force in international politics, the telluric defender of home and hearth, the fighter of wars of national liberation and decolonization. For him, it was the partisan's intense political commitment rather than his irregularity, ability to shock, or the defensive nature of his fight that distinguished him from the criminal, even though the partisan, not being a fighter recognized by the law, always risked criminality by way of his irregularity. For Schmitt, even more dangerous than the nationalist partisan was the revolutionary partisan, who, bearing absolute enmity and not being bound by a homeland, eliminated any limits to violence. And here I quote Schmitt. He says, "The war of absolute enmity knows no containment. The consistent realization of absolute enmity provides its meaning and its justice." End of quote. So how does decolonization and the more recent rise of new wars, with the emergence of radical actors, transform how we might interpret Benjamin? My main interest is to consider the specific form of partisanship these new acts of violence entail, especially those in which the human agent is not only the subject of violence, but also its immediate object. What I've elsewhere called human weapons, who fight by way of weaponizing their lives, where their self-destruction becomes part of the willful or collateral violence they inflict upon others, are marked by a sacrificial partisanship, if I may take liberties with Schmitt's formulation, a militancy defined by intense political engagement, indiscriminate violence, meaning violence not confined to military targets, and the prominence of a self-representation of their actions within a discourse of sacrifice, whether for global jihad, national self-determination, or in some few cases, the proletarian revolution. In light of these developments, which are certainly not anticipated or anticipatable by Benjamin's text, I want to ask, what is still relevant in Benjamin's critique about the relationship between violence and the law that the essay so forcefully explores? How might we mine Benjamin's text in light of the new kind of militancy that contemporary forms of extreme or extremist struggle that we witness? Considering the coordinates of our changed world, I want to ask how these new agents, with their intimate relationship to violence, put pressure on Benjamin's critique and our understanding of its ambiguities as well as its conclusions. These are the kinds of questions in light of which I want to revisit Benjamin's text on the occasion of its centennial, though I must disavow in advance the possibility of venturing any definitive answers. My much more modest goal for today, in light of the enormity of the task and the difficulty of the text, is to begin the theoretical labor of reframing Benjamin's main problematic, namely the political question of the legitimacy of violence, especially of revolutionary violence, to address the changing nature of state violence on the one hand, and the changing configuration of political agents for whom the question of the legitimacy of violence is relevant on the other. I emphasize the political here, both because it defines Benjamin's effort to think about violence as outside of the law, what he rather enigmatically called divine violence, and because I want to recall the particularly polarized context out of which his reflections grew and which in turn deeply shaped his conclusions. Let me therefore begin by offering a brief reconstruction of the text in relation to Benjamin's overall work and its context. If I were to situate the critique of violence in Benjamin's trajectory as a thinker, it would not be a stretch to characterize it as belonging to the young Benjamin rather than the mature Benjamin. Not only because Benjamin was nearly 29 years old when he wrote it, soon after he completed his doctoral dissertation, but also because the predominant concerns of his work and his political commitments went through significant subsequent transformations. The Althusserian echoes of this placement will no doubt be recognizable to many, and I don't disavow that. While I don't mean to suggest that there's an unmistakable epistemological break in Benjamin's work, I do want to underscore the important bearing that his political conversion to Marxism has had on his writings, especially in how they're awakened to capitalism and its commodification of culture, the problems and the possibilities within it, most forcefully, if fragmentedly, expressed in the unfinished and perhaps unfinishable Arcades project. The Critique of Violence essay certainly precedes Benjamin's Marxian turn. It also precedes his friendship with Brecht, from whom Benjamin learned the art of crude thinking, which cut through the philosophical tendencies of Benjamin's mind, so fond of ambiguity, paradox, aphorism, and allegory, from the perspective of the class struggle that impatiently demanded a political and brutal clarity that was rather inimical to such philosophical delicacies. Too unfortunate that Benjamin had not yet met Brecht when he penned the Critique of Violence, which would have probably taken a very different shape had it been written after that fateful encounter in 1924. Most significantly, Benjamin would, over a decade after writing the essay, recall it self-critically, characterizing his elusive reference to divine violence as, I quote, an empty blind spot, a limit concept, and regulative idea, end of quote. Or perhaps we are fortunate, philosophically speaking, insofar as it is those very ambiguities and the elusive ending that has undergirded the fortunes of this text as an enigmatic and generative meditation whose lifespan and influence have proved as forceful as other, much later of Benjamin's essays, such as the work of art in the age of its technical reproducibility, the author as producer, and the theses on the philosophy of history. Indeed, there's no better evidence for the generativity and the appeal of the text than the multiplicity of strong interpreters it has attracted in the last 3 decades, from Derrida to Hamaker to Agamben and Butler and many others. The text has occasioned rich and divergent readings that have sharpened the sense of its high stakes and contemporary relevance. That the essay precedes Benjamin's Marxian turn should not obscure its deeply political commitments, which permeate the essay's critical approach to state violence, as well as its unconcealable sympathies toward the political actions of the working class, expressed most forcefully by the syndicalist anarchist position articulated by Georges Sorel and his theory of the general strike. Let us begin by recalling that Benjamin's essay was written in the wake of a successful Soviet revolution and strong labor militancy in Germany on the one hand, and the devastation of the First World War, the economic crisis instigated by the war reparations, the failed Spartacist uprising in 1919, and the violent suppression of radical forces by the social democratic government, relying on the paramilitary forces of the Freikorps on the other hand. Objectively, it is a moment of defeat. Labor leaders such as Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht have been assassinated. The general strike has been violently suppressed. The radical political experiments in Berlin and Munich have been squashed. And yet, these uprisings and the subsequent bloodshed have given Benjamin a clarity of perspective about the violence of the state and sharpened his investment in the militancy of the working class. From today's perspective, the long 20th century that separates us from Benjamin has taken away nothing of the relevance of Benjamin's critique, but instead has made it even more acute in the present. This acuity is valid in relation to both aspects of Benjamin's critique of state violence. First, his insight that state institutions, such as parliaments, are violent, even if they appear devoid of violence. And second, his ability to register how, next to war making and punishment, and even more so than they, it is the role of the police that is devastating for democracies, which in their ambiguous and continuous back and forth between law-preserving and law-making functions of violence install a permanent state of exception on the ground. Benjamin's dual insight that the legal system cannot withstand non-enforcement and that the enforcement of the law cannot be non-violent leads him to maintain that the origins of democratic institutions lie in violence. As these origins are forgotten, these institutions begin to decay. Even though parliaments, for example, might advance a politics where compromises are made to avoid violence, they cannot avoid violence, since those compromises can only be enforced by violence. On the other hand, openly violent institutions such as the police are damaging not because of the lack of constitutional guarantees that can constrain the excesses of the police, but rather because their very mode of operation expresses something fundamental about the contradictions of sovereignty and the law, namely that the very preservation of the law demands its violation, and thus that exceptionality is the lifeblood of even democratic sovereignty, whose circulation into every tissue is only ensured by the police. Though today we may be overawed by the force of the repressive apparatus of the state in the form of militarized urban policing and expanded discretionary powers, digital surveillance, and even preemptive and predictive criminalization based on the adoption of actuarial methods, racial profiling, and risk assessment algorithms, Benjamin not only reminds us that these are constitutive of the modern state, however democratic, but also insists that we should look beyond the visibly violent to diagnose the foundational violence underlying the state as a whole. Benjamin's critique of state violence, which inevitably expands into a critique of the state tout court, has lost nothing of its relevance. But can we say the same of the object of his political sympathies? How may we read Benjamin when the radical struggles spearheaded by the working class are not present, or at least they're not present in predominantly class-based form? What happens to the category of divine violence when the worldly referent it implied, the proletariat, is woefully absent, silent and silenced, fragmented and scattered, and even discredited as a collective actor? How might the emergence of new agents of violence challenge Benjamin's endorsement of violence as pure means? To be able to accurately assess Benjamin's investment in the working class as the force to contend with not only the German state, but the violent entailments of a legal order upheld by the state as such, it is necessary to explore Benjamin's debt to Sorel in thinking about the political militancy of the working class and violence in general. Benjamin's 4 meager references to Sorel, starting halfway into the essay, should not obscure the fact that the essay is Sorelian through and through. The text precedes Benjamin's conversion to Marxism, but not his fascination with the syndicalist anarchist position. the later disillusionment with which, in a sense, prepares his conversion. Reading Benjamin with Sorel's Reflections on Violence, which had been in circulation for a little over a decade when Benjamin composed his own, and somewhat forcing the Brechtian virtues of crude thinking upon it, one cannot help but be struck by the ways in which the two thinkers converged in their mistrust of and disdain for parliamentary democracy, and their suspicion of social democratic politics, or parliamentary socialism, which advocated evolutionary, socially reconciliatory, and humanitarian mechanisms of welfare distribution, confined within the parameters of bourgeois democracy and underwritten by nationalist militarism. For Sorel, the more or less spontaneous, collective, and confrontational labor strikes constituted a necessary, elevating, and emancipatory corrective to politics as usual. Benjamin agreed. Finally, both thinkers espoused a politics that aimed to destroy or depose state sovereignty by enacting a radical rupture, or what Benjamin would much later call a real state of emergency. These agreements greatly impact the formulations in Benjamin's essay. In a sense, Benjamin takes over Sorel's problematic, in which the question of violence is situated between two poles, that of force, that is, the violence needed to protect the state, and that of proletarian violence, that is, the violence that breaks from it. For Sorel, while force represses, violence redeems. Where force reinforces authority, endeavoring to bring about an automatic obedience, violence would smash that authority. Many commentators have noted that the term Benjamin uses, Gewalt, is semantically ambiguous, and thus, for better or for worse, holds together these two terms that Sorel can keep separate, adding to the difficulties of Benjamin's text. However, despite the ambiguities of his own formulations, Benjamin follows in Sorel's footsteps in affirming and developing the constitutive qualities of Sorel's proletarian violence, which he reformulates in his own category of violence as pure means. So what is proletarian violence? Here, I would like to highlight several qualities as they occur in Sorel's thought, which form the clarifying background of Benjamin's category of violence as pure means or divine violence. Some of the connotations of Benjamin's category are not as transparent in Benjamin's essay, but become clearer when they are read in conjunction with Sorel's cogent descriptions. These qualities are, I argue, also crucial conceptual determinants to consider when approaching Benjamin's text from the perspective of the sacrificial partisanship of the present. For Sorel, whereas the political general strike fails because, quote, it presupposes that very diverse social groups shall possess the same faith in the magical force of the state, end of quote, the proletarian general strike is, and I quote again, the pure and simple manifestation of the sentiment of class struggle, end of quote. Rejecting the pursuit of material concessions, it transforms spontaneous resistance to the structural violence produced in the daily functioning of the order into collective warfare. The proletarian general strike imagines itself as an act of insurrection that severs the proletariat's ties with the existing order upheld by sovereign power. This severing, however, does not posit an alternative order, which would only substitute one master for another. Thus, proletarian violence must first be understood in its proletarian quality and only then in reference to violence. Its class character comes just as much from the vanguard effect of the deployment of violence, which transforms each conflict by polarizing the adversaries into two opposing and irreconcilable poles, as from the fact that the performers of violence are workers. By arresting the flow of daily life with the stoppage of work, and by enforcing the imagination of the social totality as one thoroughly bifurcated into antagonistic classes, what Sorel refers to as the cleavage, proletarian violence interrupts conventional politics and comes into contradiction with the ideology of the state. From the point of view of the social cleavage, proletarian violence rejects parliamentary democracy as a disheartening spectacle, Sorel's words, in which, similar to the stock exchange, votes are bought and sold, promised reforms stay dead in print, and producers are tricked out of control over their own production by demagogues. Defined by this polarizing quality, violence for Sorel is not incidental to strikes, but constitutive of them. This is not because of the blood that is shed. Sorel thinks that actual destruction and bloodshed would be minimal. It is rather because proletarian violence will perform its vanguard function by transforming workers into a specific kind of warrior, moral agents of heroic self-sacrifice. According to Sorel, proletarian violence resembles the experience of the early Christians, whose heroic resistance set apart their ideology as the absolute negation of the existing order, and themselves as distinct from the rest of the social body in an absolute cleavage. As a result, the issue was less a matter of the number of martyrs than the heroism symbolized by each martyr. Sorel argues, and this is a bit of a longer quote, so please bear with me. The statistics of persecutions play no great part in this question. What was of much greater import in the question of violence, what was of much greater importance than the frequency of punishments were the remarkable occurrences which took place during the scenes of martyrdom. It was through these rather rare but very heroic events that the ideology was constructed. There was no necessity for martyrdoms to be numerous in order to prove, by the test of experience, the absolute truth of the new religion and the absolute error of the old, to establish thus that there were two incompatible ways, and to make it clear that the reign of evil would come to an end. End of quote. The workers of Sorel's day, like the early Christian martyrs, would be bearers of sacrifice, but their absolute truth would be one offered by the myth of the proletarian general strike, encapsulating the core of socialism. Like the truth of Christianity, or any religion for that matter, the Sorelian myth is not open to refutation or piecemeal interpretation. Instead, it functions as a transcendent totality which is grasped not by reason, but by intuition. Sorel argues, and I quote, "It matters little whether the general strike is a partial reality or simply a product of the popular imagination. All that it is necessary to know is whether the general strike contains everything that the socialist doctrine expects of the revolutionary proletariat." End of quote. This necessary belief in the proletarian general strike envelopes and guides proletarian violence, giving it a redemptive and vanguard mission that expresses the common desire of holistic rupture, imparting a meaning on political practice unfounded in the imminence of politics. Just as the Christian martyrs, whose sacrifices were reinforced by the expectation of an imminent apocalypse, and that in turn reinforced the righteousness of their cause, Sorel believes that the general strike would inspire collective political action, working upon the political will, generating, unifying, and directing it, strengthening the belief in the possibility of real change. Just as each spectacle of martyrdom of the early Christians was a moral uplifting and a preparation for the final redemption, so each instance of a labor strike oriented toward the general strike would be viewed as the harbinger of catastrophic revolution. The myth would propel the masses into unified movement and prepare them for what Sorel calls, I quote, "a combat which will destroy the existing state of things," end of quote. Thus, just as Christian martyrdom brought transcendence into the imminent world of politics, so does proletarian violence. Myth is the vehicle and Christian martyrdom the model for rupturing the plane of immanence. Insofar as the myth of the general strike shrouds proletarian violence, giving it inspiration, purpose, and ultimate direction, every strike becomes an instance of sacrificial martyrdom, which rehearses its role in preparation for the ultimate Napoleonic battle and brings that battle closer through this vanguard rehearsal. The sacrificial quality of this martyrdom, constitutive of the subjectivity of the proletariat, stands in stark contrast with the ideological formulations of the rights of man. Since proletarian violence functions to demystify the foundations of the state, all conflicts become, I quote, the reduced facsimiles of the great battle which will decide the future, end of quote. Endorsing Sorel's conception of the general strike, Benjamin also sees it as embodying the potential of a total rupture with the existing order. Following Sorel, Benjamin also contends that the proletarian general strike, and I now quote from Benjamin, sets itself the sole task of destroying state power, end of quote. The proletarian strike, in Benjamin's terms, is pure means. As a philosophico-historical category, pure means implies a violence that negates the means-ends structure. It is a non-instrumental instrument and thus a non-violent violence. The end of pure means is not dissociable from itself. It is the performance of the pure means itself. Benjamin views the Sorelian general strike as non-violent violence because, and I quote, it takes place not in the readiness to resume work following external concessions and this or that modification to working conditions, but in the determination to resume only a wholly transformed work, no longer enforced by the state, an upheaval that this kind of strike not so much causes as consummates, end of quote. No longer a means to an end, proletarian violence is an anarchistic break with the existing order, a disruption of the order, particularly foreclosing its reproduction, and an interruption of the means-end structure which characterizes its political imaginary. Closely following Sorel, Benjamin also concurs that while proletarian violence is the antithesis of legal violence, it is not the absence of violence as such. Benjamin is aware that proletarian violence might involve, quote, possibly catastrophic consequences, end of quote, even as the general strike might be capable, and I quote again, of diminishing the incidence of actual violence in revolutions, end of quote. Nonetheless, Benjamin offers a critical discussion of objections to violence, both the religious ethical objection, the injunction, thou shalt not kill, and the secular moral objection, the Kantian categorical imperative of never treating the humanity in another person merely as a means. For these humanisms, religious and secular, bodily life, even if it may be vulnerable to injury by others, is sacred and worthy of preservation. Indeed, much more so than the, quote, not yet attained condition of the just man, in Benjamin's words. For Benjamin, by contrast, such views are ignoble, because they empty out just existence and therefore God from any possible meaning and relevance. To his mind, pacifist objections, wherever their motivations may come from, also play into the reasons the state gives as justifications for opposing and forcefully suppressing the proletarian strike. However, whereas Benjamin's critique of the critics of violence is clear, his description of the kind of violence he's open to embrace is not. Unlike Sorel, he leaves what this violence might look like much more ambiguous and open, only intimating it by such categories as violence outside the law, pure immediate violence, unalloyed violence, pure divine violence, etc., describing it as a kind of violence that does not make but destroys the law, that does not set boundaries but abolishes them, that does not bring guilt and retribution but only expiation, does not threaten but only strikes, does not shed blood but is nonetheless lethal. Thus, this transcendent form of violence is only presented in its negative determinations as that which breaks the cycle of mythic forms of law and abolishes state power. Sorel's references to the imagery of Christian martyrs drop out of Benjamin's essay. Instead, there's a complex discussion of mythical violence based on the ancient myth of Niobe and its juxtaposition to the biblical story of Korah, in which, I quote, God's judgment strikes privileged Levites, strikes them without warning, without threat, and does not stop short of annihilation, but in annihilating, it also expiates, end of quote. For Benjamin, revolutionary violence is divine and can bring into being that messianic cessation of history, which allows parting with the order sustained by legal or mythic violence, including the potential complicity or co-optation of the opposition within the order. Whereas the state, by its very nature, cannot sanction a revolution that will abolish its existence without becoming embroiled in an objective legal contradiction. And precisely for that reason, revolutionary forces must think violence in the exteriority to the law in order to enact that radical rupture as a remedy for injustice. Such a rupture is crucial precisely because the existing law is unable to dispense justice. Power can only be countered by justice, and justice can come, if only miraculously, from violence that is completely exterior to law, defined in its full negativity vis-a-vis both lawmaking and law-preserving violence. The difference between the mythic and the divine is not simply about the production and maintenance of order on the one hand and its destruction on the other. Guilt and retribution are opposed to expiation, extortion and escalation to abruptness, blood to its absence, bloody power to pure power, the sake of mere life to the sake of the living. I quote Benjamin, mythic violence is bloody power over mere life for its own sake. Divine violence is pure power over all life for the sake of the living. The first demands sacrifice, the second accepts it. End of quote. In my reading, Benjamin's references to sacrifice are crucial, both because of the implicit context of Sorel's citations of the early Christian martyrs and because willful sacrifice to God affirms the meaning and presence of the divine in Benjamin's Jewish messianism. For Benjamin, such sacrifice is an expression of humanity in that it saves one from the guilt of simply being alive, from being reduced to biological life. I quote, "Men cannot at any price be said to coincide with the mere life in him, any more than it can be said to coincide with any other of his conditions and qualities, including even the uniqueness of his bodily person." End of quote. However, even as Benjamin endorses a sacrificial register, he leaves the question of violence open because he concludes that it is undecidable, except perhaps with the benefit of hindsight, only available to posterity. This is because divine judgment cannot be known in advance, and even when it's realized in violence, it is not always recognizable to men. Benjamin writes, because the expiatory power of violence is invisible to men, end of quote. The opacity of the meaning of violence to those involved can be interpreted to imply that what is crucial in the moment is that the sacrifice such violence entails is not performed on demand, that it is not forcefully extracted, but instead that it is willingly offered for atonement. In a political conjuncture that is as distant from Benjamin's as is our own, how might we contend with the fact that the agents of violence as pure means are no longer on the political stage, or the ones that he had in mind are no longer on the political stage? How must we negotiate our fascination with Benjamin's text and Benjamin's fascination with revolutionary violence with the knowledge that the proletariat is no longer its sole bearer? How do we address the category of revolutionary violence in light of today's sacrificial partisans who are not hesitant to weaponize their lives and turn this whole social and political order into a battleground, and who put pressure on Benjamin's allusions to an expiatory logic of sacrifice? With the September 11 attacks and in their aftermath, with the violence of Al-Qaeda and Islamic State militants in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, for example, we've witnessed many suicide attacks and other acts of violence which were justified by their practitioners by reference to the ideal of fighting Western empire, a radical break from it par excellence. Today's sacrificial partisans, not unlike the proletarian warriors in the political imaginary of both Sorel and Benjamin, refuse the rule of law and the sovereignty of existing states. They challenge that sovereignty not only by going against the state's monopoly of violence, but also by taking the power of life and death, at least their own life and death, and often the lives and deaths of others, into their own hands. They're not pacifists. In fact, like Benjamin, they reject both secular and religious humanism, which, as we have seen, point to the presence of something sacred in the very fact of being alive in their condemnation of violence. Like Benjamin, sacrificial partisans refuse the glorification of biological existence. By forging their lives into weapons of struggle, they heed Benjamin's call for upholding a just existence over the mere fact of being alive. Let us recall Benjamin, I quote, "For with mere life, the rule of law over the living ceases." Heroism, sacrifice, and martyrdom are central to their politics, permeated with an appeal to the transcendent God. For Sorel, let us recall, it was the myth of a catastrophic millenarian revolution that will be brought on by vanguard sacrifice. For Benjamin, it was the messianic cessation of history brought into being by divine/revolutionary violence. For both thinkers, the appeal to the transcendent transformed violence by conferring upon it a redeeming, vanguard, and sacrificial quality, thus creating the conditions for the emergence of a new subjectivity. Is today's sacrificial partisan the concretization of this new subjectivity? The figure of the sacrificial partisan, both militant and martyr, weaves together the absolute enmity of the revolutionary partisan in Schmittian terms with the performance of violence as pure means, politicizing human life to its extremity. The human weapon is both human and weapon, the subject-object of violence. It combines the partisan's intense political commitment and willpower with the rejection of not only politics as usual, but also of warfare as usual. Even the human body becomes a space in which the war is fought. In this existential war, the annihilation of the militant martyr becomes the precondition of the annihilation of the enemy. Annihilation is not the consequence, but the very medium of warfare. It is the sacrificial element of this partisanship that manifests the belief that the rule of the enemy over the militant martyr or the sacrificial partisan can be brought to an end only by the annihilation of the militant martyr. Taking oneself out of the order by taking into one's own hands the sovereign's right over life and death. This is how sacrificial partisanship functions to make sovereign power sustaining that order crumble. As human weapons destroy themselves in order to destroy their enemy, they reject the possibility of conciliation and compromise. Most importantly, such partisanship attacks the enemy not only in flesh and blood, but also in its political imaginary, an imaginary defined by sovereignty and its instrumental relationship to violence. It imagines a holistic rupture from the order, a rupture that is also holy. It polarizes and paralyzes the social body with its performance of violence. It approximates an absolute manifestation of violence in Benjaminian terms. While it is hard not to recognize the resonance between the violence of these actors and Benjamin's category of violence, there is still something affectively unfitting, something hard to pinpoint concretely that remains deeply incompatible between them at the level of politics. The problem is that it is not possible to conceptualize this incompatibility given the concepts and categories of Benjamin's own essay. Benjamin's essay does not offer the conceptual, normative, or political tools with which to discriminate between a religious fundamentalist and proletarian revolutionary, neither of whom might absolutize the biological life over a just life, and both of whom might be willing to sacrifice themselves in the rejection of the existing order and in the name of justice, though with different understandings of the causes of their oppression, very different conceptions of transcendence, and understandings of what justice might mean. Though Benjamin's sympathies following Sorel clearly lie with the oppressed working class, his conception of justice remains vague. In a sense, Benjamin offers the groundwork for the legitimacy of apocalyptic violence, but the vagueness in his appeal to transcendence opens violence up for the taking. What if that appeal today is owned by forces that see themselves in a clash between civilizations, religions, and political imaginaries, rather than in a class war? That Benjamin cannot discriminate between different forms of enacting the revolutionary break becomes visible at the end of the essay, where, aware of that limit, he leaves its adjudication to posterity. Benjamin only suggests that immediate forms of violence can be distinguished according to whether such violence expresses justice or power, when he argues, and I quote, "Justice is the principle of all divine end-making, power the principle of all mythic lawmaking. However, if what is at stake in the appeal to the transcendent is precisely the presence of different conceptions of justice, Benjamin can only embrace a consequentialism where in the end, history or God will decide whether an expression of violence was just or not. Consequently, while Benjamin's endorsement of revolutionary violence rightly directs us to look outside and beyond the state, it does not give us criteria to distinguish between different kinds of sacrificial partisanship. For that, we must open the question of justice and who gets to define and decide what form a just life and a just social and political order must take. But that brings us full circle back to the fundamental question of politics, a question that Benjamin sharpens, but in my opinion, ultimately fails to answer. Thank you.